Good morning. This is going to be probably a bit controversial, but I was thinking this morning uh, about reading through Moldvay this morning, um, and then went to work on some writing um, for maybe a future project for Candlelight Games, our game company, as our game is very close now to being sent. Um, Literally, hopefully, we're a few days away from sending our book to the publishers for the next phase, which would be getting it ready for customers to order POD. We are that close. Um, Matter of fact, we've already got, I think Dell's already had a book come from Lulu. He's actually got a tangible copy from Lulu. So but I thought about this morning in reading Moldvay, and then I was going to work listening to some videos, and I thought I'm gonna take a break here, finish my coffee. I'm gonna take a break, and I want to talk about this because there there are moments that I reflect on the actual game of Dungeons and Dragons, the original. Again, we're talking about 1974 through 1981 for me, and or OSRs that attempt to recreate that. Okay, and if I was to go back in time and talk to younger Jason, what would my advice be to young Jason, right? If I could go back now to the 1981, 82 Jason about Dungeons and Dragons, which would influence how I GM uh, said game or games for the next two generations. Because if you think about this, there are millions of us, or at least thousands of us, who have DM'd D&D for now generations, and uh, our inability to actually play D&D or a D&D as written, as intended, accepting the advice of the game designer, Gary Gygax, who obviously in AD&D outlines, I think in the GM's Guide in particular, outlines very serious realities that make your sessions of D&D or AD&D paramount to the experience. And I look back and I think, having been, for the most part, myself and many of my peers, lazy, home brewing things we think would make the game better, have bastardized the experience into something I guess has been friendlier or has been easier to adjudicate or easier to administrate, but I don't believe has provided probably what Dungeons and Dragons and AD&D was literally meant to be. And the reason I even began to reflect on this to some degree was our session on Wednesday night. And when we got to the actual dungeon crawl portion of the session, and I instantly recognized, I mean, this is what D&D is. This is what AD&D is. This type of focused dungeon crawl, and how much better it felt. I mean, not that the session didn't feel great. The conversation, the characterization, the event at the gate, all that stuff still it's D&D, but it's like once we get into those tunnels, once we're thinking about light and torches and how we're going to move through this confined, dangerous, mysterious space, I recognize Dungeons and Dragons. I recognize, oh, right, this was, for all intents and purposes, the entire idea of it, right? The dungeon crawl. Now, whether we take the dungeon crawl to land and we add the same foreboding, and people say this, well, there's wilderness rules in D&D. Yeah, there are, but I think the process through that as a hex crawl is a dungeon crawl, right? I would say when I do hex crawls for Broadlands, when I do my hex crawls, I treat them just like a dungeon crawl. It's just they're outside on land, but like a golf course, they're navigating traps, they're navigating forest walls, they're navigating canyons, you're navigating something that's still foreboding, and still puts you in a frame of mind that we have to remember we have to do this, and we're going to have to search, and we're going to have to camp, and we're going to have to rest, and we're going to have to eat. And the dungeon crawl, so you just take those elements and you broaden it to a different environment. We're in a castle, we're in a dungeon, I think most GMs recognize that that's the gist. And when AD&D or D&D is put into this structure and we follow those guidelines of time. And I'm if I could go back to the 11-year-old Jason and say, listen, you don't like timekeeping, you don't like record keeping. Well, unfortunately, you should choose another game, Jason, because that is the fundamental, that's the reality of Dungeons and Dragons. For it to feel, you must track time, because that's going to influence camping. It's going to influence how we rest, how we heal, how we study spells. And I think most people have a kind of a vague reference to, hey, it's time to rest. Hey, you guys are going to have to. And then suddenly hit points, we become we begin to manage our party. And instead of trying to manage the game, we attempt to manage ourselves in a group instead of trying to manage the elements outside of our control, right? Our player agency becomes, how do we stay alive? How do we manage our resources? How important is this to the overall sense of dread, the sense of accomplishment, the sense of mystery? And if all that stuff's hand waved, it loses something, right? And for 40 years, in my lazy, sloppy homebrewing, I have contributed to this glut of 40 years of, I don't know, homebrew, OSR stuff, right? And let's face it, we've all evolved as GMs to this things we don't want to do or things we didn't like, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And I have done it. I still do it. But I look and I think, if I were to finally dive into the first edition AD&D, which I have never done traditionally, I've never actually done AD&D first edition. I've never played it, and I've never GM'd it. I have used elements of it and again pigeonholed them into my version of D&D. But you know what I never really did? I never tracked time. I never said your torch is, I didn't do those things. And because they were, for me, they seemed less relevant to what I wanted to do, which was to create this space. When in reality, the space is there. The space is created. And the sense of dread and the sense of management of our characters and of our resources and of the dangers we are facing and need to face. How do we get out? How far can we go? When should we rest? How important is the magic user in protecting the magic user, right? How many torches do we? And I realized that it's changed. It's so far removed from the advice Gary Gygax gives in his books. And through 2 generations, or maybe almost 3 generations, of the devolution of what it was intended to be and how it was intended to be played and experienced, I don't know if it's done justice to what that experience is meant to be. And again, I'm only referring to that experience. I'm not saying role-playing games all should do this. No, I'm talking about D&D, AD&D, and the OSRs that reflect back on that. So when I get an OSR and I read it and they don't refer to turns or timing and the reality of resource management, the reality of time management, the reality of how lethal it is, and maybe our characters should attempt to stay alive instead of me playing them just as a human being. I should play them aware that their death might remove me from the game, right? If Todd said to me, we're going to play tonight, gentlemen, and if you die, you're out, I would play Sarah differently, right? And the fact that we can create characters in 2 minutes makes these characters expendable, right? It is a violent game. Games that are 90% of the rules are about combat or about what can kill you: monsters, weapons, armor, combat rules, procedures for combat, procedures for saves. D&D is about combat. It is about combat. That doesn't mean you can't role play a thief, but it's going to be about combat, and there will be combat, and there should be combat. And then we should have to navigate those spaces, those dangers, those threats through resource management, time management, right? And the consequences maybe of character death, right? just thoughts as I reflect back on all the games and all the players I've invited to my table. Have I done them a disservice in providing the kinds of old D20 Dungeons and Dragons fantasy or the OSR that is a remaster of that? Have I done them in the broad strokes a great disservice? They have not really had that experience. And for what it's worth, that experience for some is not fun. That experience for some would be boring. That experience for some would be limiting in what role playing can be, which is why you would choose a different game. And in that sense, at 53 years old, having now written and developed our own game and our own style of how we ask players to be in character as character, we ask the presenter to be more naive so players can be in character as character and provide a real sense of your character's perspective on what's occurring around them. That is meant to be a different experience than Dungeons and Dragons. And when I play D&D, like as I've slowly evolved at my GMing and my want as a character to have a different experience at the table, I realized I was trying to make D&D to some degree that, and I probably did a disservice to D&D in general. And then when a game like Basic Fantasy falls into my lap and it removes some of these strictures and it removes some of these things and it frees it up for a more an easier step into that. It's really the bridge between formal old dungeon crawl games and the hack, right? Basic Fantasy in a way fits. It's like a bridge between the two, right? In a way, we remove some of the strictures and structures, but we don't go quite to the hack, right? We don't go quite to that next level of, hey, let's make everything really loosey-goosey. And oddly, my experiences in Joth have reminded me how much what I love about these old games and what I'm loving about this experience. But at the same time, I'm realizing we probably don't do it. We don't do it the justice it could be. The experience that it could be pretty intense. And maybe this is why AD&D guys are a more intense group. Maybe this is why advanced Dungeons and Dragons cats are, because they in a way, D&D was like, okay, these are some of those ideas, and AD&D is saying this is pretty much a serious, more strict thing. And maybe that's why AD&D guys have had more of those experiences. Maybe I can't say. I've never played with an AD&D group. I've only spoken to guys who are diehard AD&D guys, and I believe they've probably honed those things a little more via the AD&D tunnel into the hobby. Not to say that hasn't been slowly lost through generations, and some of those things have been thrown out. Some of the idea of what happens when the developer gives advice about what you must do to make this game really important. And I think the biggest is his quotes, and I think it's the DM guide, the Advanced GM's Guide, when he discusses time as far as the date, the time of the day, the time that's ticking away, what you need to rest, what you need to track, and you track it away from session. So if a group's away for a week, time should pass during those breaks, right? Now, obviously, that's hard to do. As you're in a dungeon, you're not going to sit in camp for a week, right? So how do we track time when we camp and we break the session, right? When we do a cliffhanger session, obviously time comes to a halt, right? And that's fine. Those are in media res situations, right? So you pick up in media res. But the fact that I'm carrying stuff and I have encumbrance and I have to have torches and I have to have oil for my lantern, and I'm playing a game OSC which has all this stuff, and I know there's rules for it, and it's important to me. I have to wonder how much richer is that experience when we really are focused on managing our character, managing the adventure as a group, a party, and we're more those elements become can become very satisfying. And what's out there, right? That's what we're delving into to face, and how can we manage this almost like a strategy game. And I think that's an interesting element that, for me personally, which is why I said if I went back in time to talk to the 11-year-old Jason, the advice I would give him: rules is written, give them the experience the game was meant to give them. And if they don't like it, that's one thing. If there's things we don't like, if we don't like that what that's about, or if we get tired of that, then you do something else. You go to Boot Hill for a month, which we did often as kids anyway. But wow. Um, and the OSR and the which I've loved. I mean, I've owned hundreds of OSRs. Well, maybe okay, maybe not hundreds. I don't know how many, but if there was never an OSR I did not get that I did not talk about and I wasn't willing to try and I wasn't willing to praise. But all of them leave out, ironically, these pieces of what D&D and AD&D were meant to be. So I wasn't the only one saying, I really don't want to deal with that. Meanwhile, they were never getting that dungeon crawl. They were never truly getting that experience. And fascinating. Not to say that that's good or bad. Not to say that that there's the best way to do this thing. But that would be the advice I would give. I've been in this business. I've been in this hobby long enough that I can say that there's now been generations of bastardized, cannibalized, and in a way, lazy adherence to what we call D&D basic or AD&D. However, I also understand that 40 years of tabletop role playing evolution has removed us from those particular experiences. But when I play an OSR like Labyrinth Lord, which is it's a direct copy of those old games, and I was not using 90% of what was in Labyrinth Lord, I did a disservice. Why did I even choose Labyrinth Lord? Well, because I recognized it, and because I respected it from my childhood, and because it was nostalgic. And then I promptly proceeded to do Labyrinth Lord completely wrong. And that's why when I came to the online community, some people really dug the way I went about running those games as a bastardized version of what they grew up doing. Some people said, dude, I really like the way you do this thing. And many came to my table and went, dude, this ain't D&D, dude, this ain't advanced. This isn't what I grew up doing. And I was surprised, right? These are the things we learned from exposing ourselves to a broader community of players and people. And we learned, but then I can now reflect back and go, what was it the other night where I really started to dig? When we got the torches out, we went into the cave and we started analyzing our surroundings and moving through that cave. And I was thinking about the torch and the light. I was thinking about the danger behind that door and how it might affect us. I was in the thing that Gary Gygax intended. And holy shit, I've not really had that opportunity a lot as a player. And I certainly have never provided it really well as a GM. I've attempted to always keep to the dungeon crawl idea, even in hex crawl open world campaigns. Hexes are just dungeon blocks. They just have different elements of nature and weather, et cetera, and different beasts and different things, right? And so I did those things, but time was always loose, right? Gentlemen, we're at midday. Gentlemen, we're at nightfall, which is fine, right? There's nothing wrong with that if we define it and we stick to it. So the players have a structure of time. They have a structure and understanding of how they can get their hit point back, resting, etc. But I thought this was an interesting thing that's struck me, and how we have evolved a style and an attitude about in character as character play, and the development of our game and how we play it differently as players and GMs, both Dell and I, and hopefully the people who come to our game, playing our game and GMing our game, are having a different experience than they have with other games. Clearly different defined experience than the OSR from my child, the OSR and the game from my youth, and the game that I prefer still. And I'm not really running it that way. And I'm not really experiencing it always that way. And that's okay. But it's fascinating to think, wow, I missed AD&D for a number of reasons. One, I was primarily our DM as a kid. And D&D for me added a bunch of stuff that was in a way over my head. I wasn't ready to contend with as a 12-year-old kid, right? Or a 13-year-old kid, however I was. And the more stuff that the more it felt like work, the less inclined I was to add it to the game or to use it in the game, right? And I would go back and I would say, did that change the joy all of us friends had in the basement eating Pop-Tarts and Tombstone pizzas and playing D&D? No, we had a great time, and we still do, and we still will. But what if I could go back and advise young Jason on what might affect generations of experience would be rules as written, try to provide the game that Gary Gygax intended, because there is an experience that you are meant to have. It may not be your preferred experience. You may play it twice and go, I'll never do that again. That's cool. But what about the thing Gary made? What about the thing that was intended? And I think OSRs, which are publications of DM's homebrews, prove that there are elements that are just ignored or hated, despised. Alignment, for instance, how many guys tell you alignment's worthless, it's pointless, it's crap, and the first thing they remove from their games is alignment, because it puts strictures on the game that they don't want to have to abide by. Meanwhile, you're not going to get that experience, right? Charisma, right? Charisma is supposed to be the single most important attribute of early D&D, because it was what allowed you to recruit people to help you defeat the Manticore, right? And we don't use charisma to talk to NPCs to recruit minions. So the Manticore is, we can then lead the group that's going to attempt to eradicate the Manticore, as opposed to a group of 4 inept, crippled first level characters trying to defeat the Manticore. It's a suicide mission, and no one would do it, right? And because we have moved so far from the roots of how the idea that you should be in the village recruiting retainers and promising them a percentage of the loot, therefore loot has to be there. So when you do kill the creature, which is what you're going to get XP for, and then you get their loot, which you're going to get XP for, you also have to give some of that loot to all your retainers. And now you get less experience, and but it becomes a game that is far more sophisticated than just dying in D&D, or just tackling problems your small group of characters cannot possibly solve. And it's fascinating, because I've been running those sessions myself for 40 years, and we've had a good time. We've always enjoyed them. But I wonder what it feels like. I don't even know. I don't think I can do it, right? I don't know if I could take AD&D or original Moldvay and actually do it justice, because those are learned skills that I have spent 40 years habitually not doing. So can I actually do that? And I'm telling you, I'm not certain that I have the skills as a DM to do those particular things properly, like allocation of time, counting turns, and managing a schedule. I have run campaigns for years and years and years and years and years and years and years, and I have never tracked time. And I mean, literally, I don't track a schedule. I'll say it's spring or it's winter or it's fall, right? It's cold, it's hot, it's wet. But I've never said it is Monday, 2 p.m. on the 3rd day of the month, right? And tracked it. I've never done that. As a matter of fact, games that provided a calendar, I always thought was kind of funny. Who the hell follows this stuff, right? Well, the dude that wrote the game must use them, right? I was thinking about Castles and Crusades, right? His campaign world provides this elaborate calendar with holidays, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought, dude, who does this? Well, the guy that runs and wrote and developed Castles and Crusades clearly does. And the people who purchase that and endeavor to play Castles and Crusades like a very good modern version of old AD&D. Castles and Crusades to me is a masterpiece, by the way. And I have played and run Castles and Crusades. Fantastic. But I would have never thought of ever using the calendar, right? If I'm remembering the game, I think it is in his campaign book, the calendar. Anyway, just a thought. What would I tell the 11-year-old Jason? Dude, provide the experience as intended and see what you get and see what comes from it. And even if I look back on the early days of flipping on Moldvay and reading Moldvay and then attempting to share it with Jeff, and Jeff had already owned it and read it, so Jeff knew more of the rules than I did. Jeff would come to the table and do any rules, and I would go, well, we're doing it this way. So Jeff was pretty good about the rules. I was not. And there were times that Jeff would, say that, dude, the rules say this. And so I had that guy at my table, right? Not a rules lawyer, but just somebody who had actually paid attention to the rules. Yeah. And even then, there were things I just was sloppy and lazy about. And of course, it was 11. I was 12, right? I had I had certain skills, and I had certain want about my Saturdays or my Monday mornings before school or whatever. Whenever we were running sessions, right? We'd even play in the morning on before school sometimes, and then have to race to school. So, you know, they were casual, and casual in a way has become my gaming war cry for 50 years. But I want gravitas. I want players to engage, but yet I treat the games very casually. And I don't know if that's a bad thing, but that permeates all the GMing games I've ever done, basically, regardless of the game. And I try to do everything rules is written, by the way. I mean, that is my war cry. I've been doing that for the last 8 years or so. Rules is written. And then once I've played and established how something works, rules is written, I'll either move away from it, never touch it again, or I'll say, this is worth playing, but this I don't like. Um, but most of it becomes sloppy homebrew habits, right, for me. So I thought this was an interesting personal observation about myself. And anyway, everybody out there, have a great week. All right, bye.